What if the next major crypto explosion doesn't begin with technology alone? What if it begins with politics? What if one executive order, one major policy shift, or one sudden regulatory announcement from Washington completely changes the future of digital finance overnight? Because honestly, that possibility is exactly why conversations surrounding Donald Trump, XRP, Ripple, and the future of the American financial system are suddenly exploding across the internet again. And the crazy part is, most people still don't fully understand how important politics may become in the next phase of crypto adoption. Seriously, for years, crypto investors mainly focus on technology, faster blockchains, lower fees, decentralization, smart contracts, trading hype. But now the conversation is evolving beyond that. Now institutions care about something much bigger: regulatory clarity. Because without regulation, massive institutional adoption becomes extremely difficult. That's the truth many retail investors ignored for years. Banks cannot just throw trillions into legally uncertain systems. Governments cannot integrate infrastructure they cannot regulate. Asset managers cannot fully deploy capital where rules remain unclear. That's exactly why crypto markets spent years trapped between massive potential and massive uncertainty. And honestly, that uncertainty slowed adoption far more than technology itself. Now, this is where XRP supporters suddenly became extremely interested in politics. Because Ripple approached crypto differently from most projects from the very beginning. Ripple didn't position itself primarily around anti-bank revolution narratives. Ripple focused on institutional integration, cross-border payments, settlement modernization, liquidity movement, financial interoperability. Those are conversations governments and institutions actually care about. And supporters believe that if America enters a new political phase focused on financial innovation, digital competitiveness, and blockchain infrastructure, Ripple could potentially become one of the biggest beneficiaries. Now, let's talk directly about Donald Trump, because this is where the internet starts going completely insane with theories. Recently, political discussions surrounding crypto have changed dramatically in the United States. A few years ago, many politicians barely understood blockchain technology at all. Now, crypto became a major campaign topic. Presidential candidates discuss Bitcoin publicly. Digital asset regulation is debated nationally. Stablecoin legislation is becoming serious policy discussion. And governments globally are racing to avoid falling behind in financial technology. That's a massive shift. Because once governments realize digital finance could become strategically important, everything changes. Now here's the part most people still underestimate. Financial infrastructure is directly connected to geopolitical power. Always has been. The systems controlling payments, liquidity, settlement, trade, infrastructure, reserve networks. Those systems influence the global economy itself. That's why countries everywhere are suddenly racing toward digital financial infrastructure development. And honestly, the United States absolutely does not want to lose leadership in the future of finance. That's critical to understand. Because of tokenization, blockchain settlement, and digital financial ecosystems continue expanding globally, the countries leading those technologies could gain enormous economic influence over the next several decades. That's why crypto regulation is no longer just a tech topic. It became a national competitiveness conversation. Now, this is where XRP supporters believe Ripple could eventually benefit massively. Because Ripple spent years focusing directly on the exact institutional problems governments and banks now suddenly care deeply about: cross-border settlement, liquidity efficiency, payment modernization, interoperability between financial systems. Those are not meme conversations. Those are trillion-dollar infrastructure discussions. And supporters believe Ripple positioned itself years ahead of where institutional finance is finally starting to move. Now again, balance matters here, because the internet constantly exaggerates everything. There's NO confirmed executive order where Donald Trump officially announced XRP replacing the financial system tomorrow. There's NO verified proof that the government secretly selected Ripple as the exclusive future infrastructure of America. Anyone presenting speculation as confirmed fact is misleading people. But what keeps fueling these theories online is a broader political shift surrounding crypto regulation itself. Because if future administrations push clearer digital asset frameworks, institutional adoption could accelerate dramatically, and XRP supporters believe Ripple may already be positioned around the type of infrastructure institutions eventually need. Now think about how dramatically institutional attitudes change in just a few years. Back then, crypto is dangerous. Today, how do we regulate crypto safely? How do we tokenize markets? How do we modernize settlement systems? How do we integrate blockchain infrastructure? That's an enormous transformation. And honestly, most people still underestimate how quickly this industry matured behind the scenes. Now let's talk about tokenization, because this is where the future starts looking absolutely massive. Most average people still don't fully understand what tokenization could eventually do to global finance. Imagine stocks becoming digital assets, real estate trading through blockchain systems, government bonds settling instantly, assets moving globally 24/7, financial systems operating through programmable infrastructure. That's not science fiction anymore. Major institutions are actively preparing for this future right now. Asset managers are investing billions into tokenization initiatives. Banks are modernizing infrastructure aggressively. Governments are developing digital asset regulations. And financial ecosystems globally are preparing for digital transformation much faster than most people realize. Now think carefully about what happens if enormous amounts of tokenized value eventually move across blockchain-based financial systems. Liquidity becomes critical. Settlement efficiency becomes essential. Interoperability between networks becomes incredibly important. That's exactly why XRP supporters believe Ripple's technology could eventually become highly valuable, because Ripple focused directly on liquidity movement between systems. Now here's where emotions inside XRP communities become extremely intense. A lot of supporters genuinely believe the market still does not understand the scale of transformation that may happen if blockchain infrastructure becomes deeply integrated into global finance. Because historically, transformational technologies almost always look unrealistic early on. At the beginning of the internet era, most people underestimated online commerce completely. At the beginning of smartphones, many analysts thought mobile ecosystems were overhyped. At the beginning of streaming, traditional media companies laughed at digital platforms. And now many investors believe traditional finance may still be underestimating blockchain infrastructure. That's why theories surrounding XRP remain so powerful emotionally, because supporters believe Ripple will position itself around the future financial infrastructure long before mainstream adoption fully arrives. Now, another reason political leadership matters enormously is because policy decisions can change institutional behavior overnight. Seriously, one executive order, one major crypto framework, one regulatory breakthrough, and suddenly massive institutions feel more comfortable deploying capital into digital assets. That's why investors now watch politics almost as closely as technology itself, because governments will heavily influence which systems integrate into mainstream finance over time. Now, let's talk emotionally for a moment, because honestly, this is why XRP communities remain so passionate despite years of volatility and criticism. A lot of people today feel financially exhausted. Inflation reduced purchasing power. Housing became harder to afford. Debt exploded globally. Traditional savings feel weaker every year. And younger generations increasingly feel like traditional financial systems no longer create the same opportunities previous generations had. That frustration creates huge emotional energy around disruptive technologies, because people desperately want to believe they still have a chance to participate early in the next major financial transformation before institutions fully dominate it. That emotional reality fuels massive XRP communities online, because supporters believe Ripple positioned itself around the next evolution of finance instead of the old system. Now, obviously, critics raise important concerns too. Competition remains intense. Stablecoins are growing rapidly. Governments may prioritize cbdc's instead. Banks may build private blockchain systems. And political environments can shift quickly. Nobody knows exactly how the story unfolds. But one thing feels increasingly undeniable now. Crypto is no longer a fringe internet experiment. Blockchain technology is becoming part of global political, financial, and institutional strategy. And if future U.S. leadership pushes aggressive digital finance innovation, the next phase of institutional adoption could become much larger than most people currently expect. That possibility alone is enough to keep XRP at the center of some of the biggest conversations surrounding the future of money today. Now here's where this entire situation starts becoming even more intense. Because once you truly understand how governments think about money, power, and financial infrastructure, you begin realizing why so many investors believe the next crypto bull cycle may not be driven by retail hype alone. It may be driven by governments themselves. And honestly, that possibility changes everything. Because for years, people viewed crypto as something outside the traditional system. But now the conversation is evolving rapidly. Governments are discussing digital currencies. Banks are integrating blockchain research. Asset managers are tokenizing products. And institutions globally are preparing for a future where finance itself becomes increasingly digital. That's a massive transformation. And the craziest part is, most average people still have absolutely no idea how big this shift could eventually become. Now think carefully about how important financial infrastructure really is. Most people only see the surface level of money. Debit cards, bank apps, wire transfers, credit scores. But underneath the surface exists an enormous global network controlling how liquidity moves around the world. International settlements, government debt systems, cross-border banking, trade infrastructure, reserve relationships, liquidity management. Those systems influence the global economy itself. And historically, whenever financial infrastructure evolves dramatically, massive wealth shifts often follow. That's exactly why governments globally are now racing toward modernization. Because nobody wants to become technologically irrelevant in the next era of finance. And honestly, the United States especially understands how important this transition could become. Because financial dominance has always been deeply connected to geopolitical influence. Whoever controls major financial infrastructure often controls enormous economic leverage globally. That's why digital finance suddenly became such an important political conversation. And that's exactly why rumors surrounding Donald Trump, executive orders, and XRP exploded so aggressively online. Because investors understand something very important now. Regulation may become the biggest catalyst for institutional crypto adoption moving forward. Not memes, not hype, not retail speculation alone. Regulatory clarity. That's the real battlefield now. And honestly, XRP supporters believe Ripple may be positioned closer to that institutional future than most people currently understand. Now again, balance matters because the internet exaggerates everything instantly. There's NO confirmed executive order where Donald Trump officially declared XRP America's financial backbone tomorrow. There's NO verified proof that the U.S. government secretly selected Ripple to replace every banking system overnight. But what fuels these theories is the broader shift happening politically and institutionally around blockchain infrastructure itself. Because governments no longer ask, is blockchain real? That debate is over. Now they ask, how do we regulate digital assets? How do we modernize payment systems? How do we integrate tokenization safely? How do we maintain economic competitiveness in a digital financial world? That's a completely different stage of evolution. And honestly, many people still underestimate how quickly the institutional world changed its attitude toward blockchain technology. A few years ago, crypto is dangerous. Today, how do we integrate digital assets responsibly? How do we tokenize markets? How do we build digital financial infrastructure? That's enormous progress in a relatively short amount of time. Now this is where XRP supporters become extremely optimistic. Because Ripple consistently focused on institutional integration instead of anti-system rebellion. That distinction matters hugely. Governments generally prefer systems capable of operating inside regulated financial frameworks. Banks care about compliance, settlement reliability, liquidity access, interoperability, scalability. Ripple focused directly on those exact areas for years. Cross-border payments, liquidity movement, settlement efficiency, financial interoperability. Those are trillion-dollar institutional conversations, not internet meme topics. And supporters believe that if the United States eventually pushes aggressive digital finance modernization under future leadership, Ripple could potentially benefit enormously from that environment. Now let's talk about tokenization, because honestly, this is where the future starts looking absolutely massive. Most people still don't fully understand how deeply tokenization could eventually reshape global finance. Imagine a world where stocks settle instantly digitally, real estate ownership becomes tokenized globally, government bonds move through blockchain systems, trade assets operate through programmable infrastructure, financial markets run 24/7 worldwide. That's not science fiction anymore. Major institutions are actively preparing for this future right now. BlackRock discusses tokenization openly. Banks are modernizing settlement infrastructure. Governments are building digital asset frameworks. Financial institutions everywhere are researching blockchain integration aggressively. Why? Because the traditional financial system contains enormous inefficiencies, settlement delays, operational costs, liquidity fragmentation, cross-border friction, and technology is now advancing fast enough to potentially solve many of those problems. That's exactly why XRP supporters believe Ripple may eventually become extremely important, because Ripple built specifically around improving liquidity movement between financial systems. Now, here's another fascinating part of this entire conversation. Artificial intelligence may accelerate blockchain adoption even faster. Think about this carefully. AI systems processing financial data instantly, automated trading systems interacting with tokenized assets, blockchain infrastructure handling settlement automatically, liquidity systems operating in real time globally. That future sounds futuristic today, but honestly, many parts of it are already beginning, and governments understand this. That's why digital finance is no longer treated like a niche technology conversation. It became a national strategic issue. Economic competitiveness, financial leadership, technological dominance. Those are political conversations now. And that's exactly why crypto regulation suddenly became such an important election topic in America. Now, another reason XRP communities remain so emotionally intense online is because many supporters genuinely believe Ripple spent years building quietly while the public remained distracted by meme coins and hype cycles. While everyone focused on short-term speculation, Ripple focused on infrastructure. That's a narrative many XRP investors strongly believe. Now, whether they're ultimately right or wrong remains uncertain. But one thing nobody can deny anymore is this. The financial world is changing rapidly. Digital infrastructure is expanding. Tokenization is accelerating. Governments are building regulatory frameworks. Institutions are integrating blockchain research aggressively. That transformation is very real. Now, let's talk emotionally for a second, because honestly, this part matters more than many analysts admit publicly. A lot of people today feel financially trapped. Inflation reduced purchasing power. Housing became harder to afford. Debt exploded globally. Traditional savings feel weaker every year. And meanwhile, giant institutions always seem to position themselves early before the average person fully understands what's happening. That frustration creates huge emotional energy around disruptive technologies, because people desperately want to believe they still have a chance to participate early in the next major transformation before the system fully adapts. That emotional reality fuels enormous XRP communities worldwide, because supporters believe Ripple positioned itself around the future of finance long before mainstream institutions publicly acknowledged where the world might eventually head. Now, another massive factor driving XRP optimism recently is the idea of interoperability. And honestly, interoperability may become one of the most important concepts in future finance. Because even if governments create separate digital currencies, even if banks build different blockchain systems, those networks still need ways to communicate and move liquidity efficiently between each other. That's critical. Without interoperability, digital finance becomes fragmented and inefficient. Ripple focused directly on solving interoperability challenges between systems. That's one reason supporters believe Ripple's infrastructure could eventually become highly valuable in a tokenized global economy. Now, obviously, critics still raise legitimate concerns. Competition remains intense. Stablecoins continue expanding rapidly. Governments may prioritize centralized CBDCs. Banks could develop entirely private blockchain systems. And regulations themselves may evolve unpredictably. Nobody knows exactly how this story ends. But one thing feels increasingly undeniable now. The next era of finance will probably look dramatically more digital than the world people grew up with. And political leadership, executive policy decisions, and regulatory frameworks will heavily influence which technologies eventually dominate that future system. That alone is why XRP remains one of the most emotionally powerful and controversial conversations in the entire crypto world today. Because supporters believe Ripple may not simply be another cryptocurrency. They believe it could eventually become part of the infrastructure powering the next evolution of global finance itself.